Hello, my name's Craig Clark, and I'm a third year PhD student at Northumbria University in the UK. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my PhD thesis, which, as you can see on the screen, is titled Screening Psychedelic Aesthetics. And it's more specifically focused on film and television representations of LSD experiences. So in a moment, I'll explain to you why I've gone for LSD experiences particularly. But first, I just wanted to share a little something about the experience of doing a PhD. So I'm nearing the end now. I'll be submitting in September of this year. And it's quite like, I suppose, this extended psychedelic experience in some ways. So there's a lot of ups and downs. There's confrontations with the self. There's insight gained, knowledge gained. There's challenges along the way, but it's also very exciting, I guess. But the thing that's absent from doing a PhD, of course, is this kind of aesthetic sensory effects that you get with the psychedelic state. And because I've decided to study that for my thesis, I guess I'm bringing that to the party today. So what I'm going to begin by doing is introducing why I'm doing this study. So it's timely and it's original. Anyone with a passing interest in psychedelics, and even people without a passing interest, might be aware that we are going through something of a psychedelic renaissance. But people are perhaps less aware of is that at the same time, as the film scholar David Church has noted, there's been a sort of resurgence in psychedelic aesthetics among mainstream films and music videos. So this is kind of important because there's a number of scholars, including Church, have noted, also Anna Powell and Lana Cook. Audiovisual media is possibly a better way of conveying the psychedelic experience than the written word. And the reason for this is film is a multi-track medium that can convey both audio and visuals, whereas writing is a one-track medium where you have to kind of describe the experience. That isn't to say that, in my thesis anyway, that written descriptions aren't important, because the whole idea of what I'm doing is this meticulous analysis. So I'm looking at both what's written in the psychedelic literature and what's represented in film and television. And the idea is that they both enrich each other. So this is something that's kind of intertextual, as it's kind of discussed in film and literary studies. And all of this is kind of important because, as Stephen Siff noted, he was talking about kind of the 60s psychedelic revolution, but I think it applies today too, that for many people, their first and maybe only encounter with the psychedelic experience might be either watching Netflix in the home or in a movie theater watching a film. And as Cook has also noted, aesthetics are important because they do broaden public and scholarly understanding of psychedelics. And as she's noted as well, we do need to have more studies of this type. And by my count, there's only around 13 of them in existence. And my PhD thesis will be the first book length in the screen studies oeuvre. So that also lends itself to its originality and hopefully its significance. However, there is a broader context within which these studies are emerging. So film and psychedelics have long got this long kind of entwined history. It goes back to film being used as a metaphor by both scholars and recreational users to describe their psychedelic experiences. So you could think of Tom Wolfe's use of the term eyelid movies in his seminal counterculture text, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. The first psychedelic film is probably 1954's The Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome. That's the one that's usually cited as being the first. However, it doesn't feature any explicit psychedelic use. It's purely its aesthetics that are considered to be psychedelic. However, it was more explicitly identified as psychedelic in its 1966 re-release as the Sacred Mushroom Edition. So in the intermission of that film, when it was screened in 66, those who were interested in watching the film while on a psychedelic, in the psychedelic state, were given instruction of when to take their sort of LSD-laced sugar cubes. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that particular genre of film in a moment. What you can see on screen is the 1959 film The Tingler, starring Vincent Price, who you can see on screen here. And this is the first to explicitly refer to as psychedelic, and then to represent, as you can see, very crudely, its visual effects. Later, in the mid to late 60s, between 66 and 68, and particularly a slew of films that belong to what Harry M. Benchoff calls the LSD film microgenre released. And among them was the 1967 film The Trip. Now, this is one of the key case studies in my thesis, and it's also one I'm going to show you some examples of in a moment. And what's interesting about, one of the things anyway, that's interesting about The Trip is that Corman actually took LSD for inspiration in the making of his film. Now, creatives have often taken psychedelics for inspiration, and another filmmaker who was no stranger to LSD is Alejandro Jodorowsky. Now, his 1973 film, The Holy Mountain, is an example of a head film. So one of the definitions of a head film is a film that's been identified by its filmmaker as something that should be watched in the psychedelic state. And as you can see from the quote on screen here, Jodorowsky wanted his audience to arrive at the movie stoned, as well as to get high on the movie. As a side note, it's also interesting that Jodorowsky administered psychedelics to the cast on set. So it was performed high, this movie, or at least some sections of it were anyway. Another type of head film is one that's identified by the audience as something that might be pleasurable to view in the psychedelic state. And Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, which you can see on screen now, was an example of that. So audiences were going and seeing this famous Stargate sequence and thinking, wow, this would be enhanced by LSD, and would turn up to the theater high to watch it. There's some contention over whether Kubrick himself ever did take any psychedelics. But whether he did or he didn't, his film certainly attracted a head audience. So those films, The Holy Mountain, the previously mentioned inauguration of the Pleasure Dome in 2001, there's no character in those films using a psychedelic. They're also not mentioned in the film psychedelics. The films I'm focusing on are focused purely on the LSD, use of LSD and LSD experience, and they're used by characters. So there are reasons for this. We know that the phenomenology of psychedelic experience differs between different psychedelic substances. So it is much better, if you're going to be exact, to focus on just one. LSD, there are countless examples of films and TV shows. So that gives me a great sample size for my study. That's one of the reasons. Characters, they're human analogs. So when we're watching a character use a psychedelic, it's very explicit that what we're being treated to is the psychedelic experience, but it also means we can examine the character and their experience, their sort of transformation maybe by the psychedelics. Does their character change as a result of the experience? And this lends itself to the structure that I've used, which is based on Patrick Lundborg's psychedelic trip schematic, which you can see on screen, taken from his book, Psychedelia. And that shows the psychedelic experience broken into stages. Now, none of the other studies in film studies address these higher stages above the sensory realm. So that is also lends itself to the novelty of my project. And what I think is important is we're looking at examples here in the course of my study and in the talk to come, where characters are transformed by their experience, or at least experience things that are relevant to the psychedelic renaissance and its focus on the therapeutic effects of the drug state. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through some examples. I'm going to do a bit of show, not tell here, because, you know, what better way to illustrate what film and television can do than to show you. So let's start with the sensory realm. In their 1966 seminal book, The Varieties of Psychedelic Experience, Masters and Houston talk about how there are so many sensory realm effects that it would just be an endless process to catalog all of them. So I'm not going to do that either. It suffices to say, sensory effects are, as the name suggests, they affect all of the five senses. Although film and television representations are predominantly audio-visual, sometimes you do get characters responding in other ways. And they're relatively meaningless in the sense that, you know, they're enjoyed or they could be frightening, but they're just a sensory experience. There's not a great deal of meaning being derived here. So let's rather than me listing a bunch of effects, let's get into it and let's look at some examples. And we'll begin with the trip, which I've already mentioned. What you've just seen there is the character Paul, who's played by Peter Fonda, pull an eye shade down over his eyes. And then we get a cut to his POV. And this is a subjectively inflected POV shot. What that means is we're seeing his perspective. And we know this because the shade comes down over his eyes. This transforms the shot into a subjectively saturated POV shot. And now we're in his inner visions. And that's what we're getting on screen here. It's a 60s film, so they might look a little bit rudimentary, but this is very typical of the kind of light shows at the time that people were starting to develop. And they really do represent the primitive visuals that you would get at the outset of the sensory realm. You get the pulsing colored lights, the flashing dots, the kaleidoscope vision, and a variety of other effects. Next, we're going to take a look at an auditory hallucination in a more recent example. It's an episode of Mad Men. And just to give you some context here, we're going to hear an auditory hallucination from the character in the background's point of audition, and that's Roger. And we're not going to get a setup in the way we did with point of view, because point of audition, there's not quite the same film language that's consistently used to sort of establish point of audition. However, we know we're sharing his perspective on the psychedelic experience from previous shots. And what I should also note at this point, and I should have said previously, each of these characters has taken LSD, and we do see that. We just don't see it in the clips that I'm showing you. Anyway, Roger's going to open a bottle and hear some music, and I'm going to play that for you now. So as you can see, what we get here is an audio-visual phenomenon for the audience. So it's called syncresis. That's a term created by the scholar Michel Chion, and that means there's a sync point created between the sound and the image. But for Roger, it's just a sound. It's an auditory hallucination. He hears music that doesn't exist in the film world for anyone else. So that's a hallucinatory phenomena that only he hears. And there's a kind of thing going on here where he's got the Russian vodka, and it's the Song of the Volga Boatman that plays. So that's like a Russian piece of music. And as you can see, is typical of the sensory realm. He's kind of amused by this experience. Next, we're going to have a little bit of sound and visual. Now, what's important to note here is that the director of this film, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, has never taken any psychedelics. Now, this is an adaptation of a book by Hunter S. Thompson, and Thompson was a prolific sort of LSD and mescaline user. However, this sequence is just from his imagination, Gilliam's, I should say. It's not in the book. So what we're getting here is this sense that there's maybe a psychedelic text that exists all around us. It's a culturally known thing, because scholars like Patrick Lundborg and Harry Benshoff have both noted that this is a really realistic rendering of this carpet crawling, undulating effect. We're also going to get an acoustic spatial distortion, which kind of reflects the type of phenomenon described by Ken Kesey, who on his first psychedelic experience noted that an acorn dropped by a squirrel outside of the room he was in sounded so loud as if it was in the room with him. So let's play this clip and take a look.
The waitress, about 16 years old, they chopped the goddamn head off right there in the parking lot, and then they cut all kinds of holes in her and sucked out the blood. They wrapped the pineal gland, I think. Yeah. No, how's your mama?
So again, we've got these subjectively inflected POV shots from the perspective of the character Raoul Duke, who you can see here on screen. Close-ups also encourage shared perspective between the audience and the character. But the sound here, I mean, the carpet crawling, that's digitally created. We see it come up the man's leg and up the walls. But the thing to note here is how the sound is distorted slightly, which indicates that it isn't a film technique to just suggest that, oh, his attention's drawn to it. His attention is drawn to it, but it sounds louder as if the man has gotten closer to him when neither person has actually moved. We're going to move on to the recollective analytic stage next. And as the name of it suggests, this is about the recall and analysis of memories. Now, these don't necessarily have to be real memories. They just have to be plausible. That's something that Stanislav Grof states. But generally speaking, an individual is going to remember something, maybe relive it, become totally immersed in the memory. And we're going to look at an example of age regression in the film Mad to Be Normal. So this is a biopic of the radical 60s psychiatrist R.D. Laing. And Laing sets this scene to sort of a classic set up for the character Sydney, who you can see here. And he tells him if he takes LSD, you might be able to unblock some difficult memories. So what we're going to see here is Sydney in the present and flashbacks to him during his childhood. So we're going to watch the clip and I'll tell you a little bit more about it.
I think I'm 7. I can smell something.
So as you can hear from what Sydney says, he says, I think I'm 7, and he also, which suggests stage regression. And the fact that he can smell something suggests that he's totally immersed in this memory. And the cross-cutting between the present and the past indicates that these are like sort of simultaneously occurring events. So while the eidetic image sequence, so that's something else to note about recollective analytic level, they're typically eidetic image sequences, which is what we have here. The flashbacks in black and white, which isn't the characteristic bright colors of psychedelic experience, but it is the film language of flashback that suggests memory. And for an audience not familiar with psychedelic experience, it makes it less jarring because it is a very traumatic memory where Sydney sees his mother murdered by his dad, and then his father commits suicide. So seeing it in bright colors might have been jarring for an audience. On the symbolic level, we usually have more eidetic images as well, but in this example, we're going to look at a mirror image sequence. So symbols can include classic religious symbols, but also totemic animals, something someone might not have recognized as a symbol before, like a lion might become a symbol on this level. Now, what we're going to look at is an example of the chakras being activated symbolically. And as Stanislav Grof again notes, you don't necessarily have to have any knowledge of the chakras for them to be activated in the psychedelic state. And that's probably true of this sequence. There's little to suggest our protagonist, Paul, knows anything about them, about the chakras. So here we see him look in the mirror there. This is his mirror image. And these shapes and red lines start to intersect at this point between his forehead. So the lines kind of are this classic geometrization you get in a mirror image. And this intersection around the point in the middle of the forehead suggests the activation of the third eye chakra. In the next shot, you'll have seen his eyes blink transparently. So I'm interpreting that as him seeing things anew. Then we get the shapes pouring first forth from his mouth, and then a hallucination of his estranged wife, Sally's. So what I'm interpreting that is the throat chakra being activated. So what we get here is a sequence that implies Paul gains insight into the reason his marriage with his wife has failed is related to his inability to communicate with her properly. Finally, let's take a look at the peak experience. Now, as Patrick Lundborg notes, we're getting into the area of non-dualism here, which is more difficult to represent pictorially and linguistically. Nonetheless, there are certain facets of peak experience that can be represented and are represented in Taking Woodstock. And I'm just going to dive straight into it because it's all really in this sequence. You'll have seen our protagonist there, Elliot, tears streaming down his eyes, clearly emotionally overwhelmed, a hallmark of peak experience. Next, what you've seen there on the screen is the Woodstock stage. Now, the object of perception becomes the center of the universe in peak experience. And that's kind of what's happening here, is it becomes this electrical charge that turns into a bright, blinding white light that engulfs the screen. So we're not only getting the white light of peak experience, it's as if our protagonist, Elliot, whose perspective we're sharing here, merges with it. Again, another hallmark of peak experience as described by Maslow. So that's where I'm going to leave my analysis of these different examples. And I'm just going to conclude with some thoughts about where this kind of study might go. So we know music's really important in psychedelic therapy, but what about a visual element? Could film or something even more immersive like VR or something in a room that's like surrounded by visuals be used in psychedelic therapy? What about a study proposed by David Church as psychedelics become more legalized and more free to use? Could we do an experiment that would recreate the kind of reception conditions that I was talking about earlier for the head films, where viewers can be not interrogated, that's the wrong word, but interviewed after watching a film in the psychedelic state and find out how those reception conditions recreate what we had in the 1960s. I hope you've enjoyed this talk, and I hope you can see the importance and relevance of it. And that is my time up, and I would like to thank you for listening. Thank you.